Hello, Alan Ryder, Southeastern Railway Museum. And I didn't really expect to be working on our little switch engine 8202, but it kind of threw us for a loop this weekend during our event, Trains, Trucks, and Tractors. She started to kick the low oil button, and so we got to figure out what's going on there. I have some suspicions, and we'll do some troubleshooting and find out. When railroaders use the expression kicking low oil, what they're actually talking about is there's a mechanism on the governor, which is what this is showing, to protect the engine when the oil pressure gets too low. There's a little button on the side of the governor, and when oil pressure, squeeze in here, when oil pressure gets too low, this button comes out. That's called the low oil button, and it's controlled by the governor, and it's a protection. And so this guy, as engine got hotter, she was running during the day, the engine wasn't overheating or anything, it just when it got hotter, the oil gets thin. That's just normal, and it was thin enough that the governor detected low oil pressure and shut the engine down. And we put a little bit of oil in it, but that didn't help. So it'll be handy to know what the oil pressure is before we start tearing things apart. And this is the panel on the engineer side of the cab with all sorts of gauges, and several of them are lube oil pressure gauges, but they don't work. Or if they do work, we don't know for sure. So step one is going to be to pull that apart and take a look at the gauges. Follow the oil lines back and be sure they are where they are and which gauge does what. And we'll go from there. It's been a couple of weeks since I worked on this thing, and I did a little bit of research, got a few pieces and parts. Basically the lube oil system on this locomotive is like every other EMD locomotive. It's a little bit different as far as the components, but lube oil on this one comes out of the scavenging pump. That's where I'm pointing the camera. Goes up through there and down below and into the lube oil cooler, which in this locomotive is inside the water expansion tank. That's what the camera's pointing at now. And it comes back out of the lube oil cooler, goes into the oil filters, which is the square box on the other side. And from the oil filters it goes into the basically a reservoir over there, and from that reservoir then the main lube oil pump picks it up and draws it into the engine. And again, like the other locomotives, there's a piston cooling pump, and then there's a main lube oil pump, and it's even harder to see on this locomotive than on the other ones. So what I've done is I've got that gauge that you can see right there. That's connected to the main lube oil pump discharge. That's the section of the main lube oil pump that goes to the bearings. And then over here, this is the oil line, comes out of the engine and goes to the governor. And it should, when we start this up, if everything's working right, those two should have approximately 100 pounds of pressure on each one. Found We're going to check the viscosity. This is kind of the same thing I did in an earlier video with 8954. This is clean oil, fresh oil, and then the other bottle is a sample. Since you can't see through it, I figure copper tubing is good as anything. Drop this ball in, and when I feel it at the bottom, that's going to be the time. All right, here's the sample oil. So 1, 2, 3, start. Stop.
Yeah, just over about 8 seconds.
Okay, one of them is 8 seconds and the other one's 8 seconds, so there doesn't appear to be anything wrong with the viscosity of the oil, which I kind of suspected. What you're looking at there is the strainer box. This is the end where oil coming from the scavenger pump goes through the filters, and they're back behind, and then they come into this part of the tank, and then the main lube oil pumps, piston cooling and main lube oil, draw the oil out of this through strainers, and we suspect that possibly those strainers are plugged up. So we're going to pull the lid off and pull the strainers out and see what we can find. So the great unveiling. Those are the strainers being held down. So next step's to get them out. Never seen this before. So there's one filter. There's my flashlight. Kind of. All right, this is one of the two strainers from the filter box, and if I got my flow correct, the oil from the lube oil filters comes out of the lube oil filters and goes into the strainer box where this came from, and then as the main lube oil pump draws oil, it sucks it in the outside and then through the bottom and on into the pump. And while we were watching the engine run, I noticed that the pressure on the main lube oil pump was fluctuating. And, you know, again, as the oil got thinner and thinner as the engine warmed up, the pressure went down until it finally got to the point where it kicked low oil and the engine shut down. I'm suspecting that these strainers are plugged. Now, one of the interesting things that I discovered when I started looking, I was looking at the top deck to see how oil was flowing there, and this left side of the engine had some work done on it a while ago, and they painted the inside of the top deck, and I noticed that that paint was kind of peeling off. And then in looking at the elements here, we may be able to see it better when I take the filter apart, or the strainer apart, there's little flakes of orange paint in here. There was some on the top of this too. So I got the nut off, so let's see what door number 1 shows. That's the cover. And I've never taken one of these apart, so we'll see how it goes. This is where the oil would come out of the strainer and go to the pumps, so it really doesn't look too bad. So this is actually the strainer element. I'm not sure if it's my imagination or not, but as I spray this with brake clean in, it goes through the strainer and going from the inside to the outside, which would be reverse flow. It seems like I'm getting little flakes of stuff on the bench. And I wipe it off, and it seems like as I spray some more, I get more. So there may be a bunch of crud in this thing. I can't really tell. So what I'm going to do, I'll take the other one apart, and I think what we're going to do is to dunk them in a bucket of diesel fuel and flush them out. All right. This is going to be the great unveiling. This is the filter housing, and we're going to pull the lid off and see what the filters look like, and likely pull the filters. This is the filter housing. These are the filters. This is a holder to hold this plate down. So next step is we're going to take this off so we can get to the filters, and you got springs to hold the filters down. Houston, I think we might have found the problem, or at least a problem. That's not supposed to have a hole in it. So this is one of the 4 filters. And Chris, if you can scroll over here, you can see crud on the top of this filter I haven't pulled out. So we're going to pull the filters and get new ones and probably drain this down and see if there's any crud in the bottom of the tank. That's the answer to maybe our issue, I hope. So we're going to do some cleaning. These sleeves come out, but it's like handling a greased pig, so I put a couple channel locks on, or vice grips on them, and we'll wrestle them out.
That one's nice and gross at the bottom.
Oh, by the way, did anybody tell you they're heavy? Got it. All right, we've got the sleeves out, and now I can kind of understand how this system works. But this is one of them where the sleeve's been taken out, and the oil comes up through that hole, the offset hole, and that goes around the outside of the inside of the sleeve, between the sleeve and the outside of the filter. It goes through the filter, and once it goes through the filter, it exits the top of the filter, and there's a hole in the filter. You can see the holes there, and runs out of the hole in the center of the filter, through the top of that hole, and then runs out into the outside of this filter box. Well, it's another day, and we're going to start cleaning things up to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. And first thing we'll do is try to clean the lube ball strainers. Well, thoroughly blown out, and this tray was completely clean when we started, and you can see all the crud that's on it now, so hopefully we got enough out to be good. I'm going to vacuum out all the crud that's in the bottom of the filter box housing with that poor little vacuum cleaner we're going to abuse. And I got a GoPro clone camera, so maybe you'll get some action of the dastardly deed. And we got the strainer box cleaned out as best we could, flushed with diesel fuel. That's the strainer side, and we'll stroll over here. And that's the filter box side, cleaned as best we can. Lots of crud in there. Well, we got the filter housing cleaned up. So now we're working on all the components inside. This is one of the 4 pressure cylinders. That's what EMD calls them. The filter sits inside of that. And this is the cover for the strainer. Cover for one of the strainers. So we're doing a cleanup right now, getting as much crud off as we can. Another fine day comes to a close. Thought we might get the thing put back together, but it's late. We're tired. Got all the hardware cleaned up, strainers clean, all the associated hardware with the strainers, pressure cylinders, the lids, the hold downs, all that good stuff. Okay, now that we got everything cleaned up, I already put the strainer assemblies back together, and we've got the pressure cylinders and all that cleaned. So we're going to take it out to the locomotive and start putting all the pieces back together. So we got all the pressure cylinders over here. Now I've got to wrestle them back into the filter housing. But before I do that, I need to put this gasket down in the bottom. And this gasket, there's 3 other ones. They didn't want to come out, but this one did. So we got to put it in and make sure it's lined up. So that's the next step. Use this pry bar to line it up. Now the fun begins. One down and 3 to go. All 4 of them are in. Okay, now we get to put the filters in, so that's not quite as big a struggle. Just one. Kind of like I explained before, the oil from the scavenging pump comes out of the crankcase, goes through the lube oil cooler, and then goes through these, comes out the holes in the bottom of this tank here and into the outside of these pressure cylinders, and then through the filter and out the top. So filters are in, and the next step, which I may or may not need, is I'm going to fill these pressure cylinders with oil, and hopefully that will help get them ready for service. Whenever you're ready, you can turn it on. This may take a while, so you don't need to watch the whole thing. Okay, next step is just to give the main lube oil pump a head start. I'm going to try to shoot oil in these two holes, which is the inlets from the strainers into the main lube oil pump. Let's fill that one up, that's good. This one's probably already full, since it's a common pipe. Yep. All right. Okay, and we'll put the covers back on the cylinders. And the plate. All right, now all we'll need to do is get the nut and start tightening this down. That will compress the springs and get everything more or less oil tight. That should be good enough. Okay, when the oil goes through the filters, comes up through the center of the filter and comes out here and then runs down the outside into the filter box, and that lid, as you'll see in a little while, it's got sight glasses on it so you can actually see the oil flow. So we'll show you that in a little bit. Final step is to put the lid on. Learn a bit about industrial archaeology as we do the work on this locomotive, and it's pretty apparent that these strainers weren't the original design and it's been modified. These spacers were at the bottom of the housing where these strainers sit, and you can see wherever they came from, they were simply torched, cut out of something or other. But these go on the outlet of the strainers and inlet to the bottom of the strainer box, and they basically kind of just sit either like that, yeah, like this. So I have to put those in place before we put the strainers in. So it's just a bit of industrial archaeology and how things have changed over time. There's a few other things like that on that filter box. So you learn as you go. Okay, I got those spacers put in, and so now it's time to put the strainers in. So we'll put the strainers in. Just like that. Strainers installed. We can leave that lid off while the engine's running because there's no pressure up here. So when it finishes filling up with oil, the tank, that's what the gurgling is. And we'll start her up and see what happens. Okay, here goes the acid test. Oh. Let it up. The sound of the engine is so loud that it's impossible to talk over it and be understood. Plus the microphone can't deal with it either. But after waiting about 20 seconds, which seems like forever, but it's normal, the oil pressure coming out of the main lube oil pump came up quite nicely to like 65-ish psi, and then in just a couple seconds later, the pressure for coming out of the engine itself came up to something around 45 psi. Again, very good pressure and exactly what you'd expect with cold oil. Cover's back on the strainer housing now, and everything is back together. The engine's been running for about 20 minutes or so now, and it's up to operating temperature. Pressure coming out of the main pump is around 40 pounds, and the pressure coming out of the engine toward the governor is right around 26 pounds. And according to the manual, that pressure should be at between 16 and 25 psi at idle, so we're right where we should be. Well, we have success. Everything's back together. We got decent oil pressure, and she should be good to go back on the road. And I have to thank Chris here, as well as several other folks who aren't around right now, Andrew Durden and Randy and Ryan B. So for everybody, thank you much and enjoy.
All right.
And come see us.
Of course.